Good morning. Good morning, everyone. A very warm welcome to everyone here in the room. And also an equally warm welcome to people joining us online. My name is Annelotte Krena de Jong, and it's a real pleasure to open this session, Investing in Resilient Landscapes, here at London Climate Action Week. Over the next 3 hours, we will be talking about resilience in agricultural landscapes and how to build the confidence and unlock the investment they need. But first, a few practicalities. First, this session is being live streamed and recorded, so please keep that in mind. The recording will be published in the coming days. 2, we would love to bring some of your questions to our speaker, our moderators, our panels, and we are using Slido for that. Let me check if that works. Not yet, but you can already see it working. Wonderful. You have the QR code on the screen. You can scan it with your phones. You can put in questions. You can vote up questions from other participants. And we have already added a question for you to answer, which will feed into the discussion of the first panel. Third, it is hot, if you haven't noticed. We've taken every possible precaution. We've put down the curtains. We've added extra chairs so you could spread out. We've added fans. And there is a lot of water available, but please keep yourself as comfortable as possible. We'll try to keep things cool enough for the whole morning. This event is brought to you by 2 organizations, ISEAL and the Jurisdictional Action Network. ISEAL works with ambitious sustainability systems so they can address the world's most pressing challenges more effectively. Notably, they support a network of landscape practitioners in setting standards and good practice on landscape governance, measurement, and claims. The Jurisdictional Action Network is the global learning and community platform for private sector engagement in production landscapes. We have a website, jresourcehub.org. We have a second website, SourceUp. We organize webinars, send out newsletters, all with practical resources and information on how landscape initiatives work and how companies can engage effectively with them and benefit from them. Particularly in SourceUp, you can find now over 80 different landscape initiatives, all worthy of your interest and your engagement. ISEAL and the Jurisdictional Action Network share a common belief that we need more and better multi-stakeholder collaboration to address the systemic issues that we are facing as a society, notably climate change, nature loss, and poverty. That starts with understanding each other's perspectives, priorities, and with speaking each other's languages. That is what we work on as organizations every day, and that is also what we are doing here today with you, in this room, online, on the stage. We have investors, supply chain companies, civil society, practitioners on the ground, policy and reporting experts. You are that community of stakeholders that is so essential to address the challenges I just discussed. And this event is meant to create more clarity on our shared interests, relevant approaches, and key hurdles that still need to be taken, and hopefully also provide some inspiration, great examples, connections, and provide concrete ideas for action. Action on what? That brings me to the topic of today. And I'll try to break it down in 3 parts. 1, the problem. Climate change and nature loss are disrupting agriculture around the world. In the global south, productivity is already up to 35% lower than it would be without climate change. 35%, that's a lot. The longer term projections are stark. And I have, yes, the slides are now working. Some examples you see on the screen. But it's the climate shocks that already affect us right now. Weather extremes like droughts and floods that used to come once in every 50 years now come every 10 years, and they are expected to come more and more often. Those aren't just numbers, it's a personal, economic, and societal challenge. And that's why our theme today is resilience. Resilience is the capacity to prepare for, withstand, absorb, adapt to, and recover from climate events. But there's an opportunity in there. The need to increase resilience in our agriculture worldwide is something almost everyone can agree to. Investors, civil society, government, business, and within business, sustainability and commercial teams are increasingly pulling in the same direction. Part 2, resilience cannot be achieved on a single farm alone. It cannot be achieved by one company or within any one supply chain. Farms depend on ecological, hydrological, economic, and governance systems that reach far beyond any property line. That is why, next to action on farms, it is essential to act on the level of the landscape. The landscape is where ecosystems hold back landslides, provide pollination, cycle water, and buffer wind. It is also where governments implement laws, and it is where companies organize their sourcing, processing, and logistics. Landscape and jurisdictional initiatives act at precisely that scale. They bring stakeholders to one table to agree on shared goals. They coordinate actions, co-invest, and organize efficient and trusted monitoring. And more importantly, even, they learn. And the approach, the landscape approach, is catching on. According to CDP disclosures, in 2020, it started out with a few handful of companies. I think it was 27. In 2025, it was up to 388 companies disclosing their investment in landscape initiatives and 56 states and regions. In the meantime, front-running coalitions like the Consumer Goods Forum's Forest Positive Coalition have stepped together to coordinate, strengthen, and do their reporting on landscapes jointly. And not only CDP, but other frameworks like SBTN and TNFD now treat landscape engagement as a key part of disclosure and as good practice. That means the momentum is growing. But there is, of course, a hurdle. The capital that is needed to create resilience at the scale that we need is not yet available. Now, don't take me wrong, there is capital. Most initiatives currently there launch on public and philanthropic grants, and those are essential to get them started. But they are hard to sustain in the very long term that resilience needs or at the scale. On top of that, there is more, and I want to kind of stretch the idea of investments. Obviously, it's not just grants. When companies commit to buy for 10 years from a certain region, that is investing in resilience. When traders fund technical assistance for regenerative agriculture, that is investing in resilience. When banks link their lending to verified deforestation free, that is investing in resilience. And when brands pay a premium for traceable forest positive product, that is investing in resilience. Nonetheless, it is not by far yet at the scale that we need. Finance is often already hard to access in many agricultural landscapes, and it can be even harder for the still hard to quantify and long-term resilience investments we are talking about today. Too few companies and financiers are yet confident they will capture the value that these investments create. Closing that gap in investment and in confidence is the work right ahead of us and is the subject of this morning. So just very quickly, the agenda. After this, we will have a keynote. Then we go into a panel exactly about finance in resilient landscapes. We will have a 30-minute break. And after that, another panel. Especially during the breaks, I forgot to mention that earlier, please feel free to move outside of the room. There's air-conditioned room across the hall. There's a cafe downstairs that's air-conditioned. The courtyard is very pleasant. So that will be a moment that we can all cool off. Now, it is time to introduce our keynote speaker. So far, I've been talking about the big picture. But really learning happens best when you talk about a concrete example. And it is taught to you by somebody who actually has done it, work on resilience. So it is my great pleasure to introduce Richard Smith. Richard is the executive director of the PCI Institute in Mato Grosso, Brazil. Mato Grosso is one of the clearest examples I think we have. There, a coalition of public, private, and civil society partners has been building a more resilient landscape for over a decade. And Richard has been part of that journey since 2017. First, as a consultant leading the Corporate Action Group, then as the regional coordinator for the Amazon Research Institute, and as a director since 2023. We will run this as an interview. So the first two questions to Richard will come from me. After that, there should be some time for questions from the audience. So please, again, put them in Slido. We will bring them to Richard. Richard, warm welcome, and thank you for being here. Thank you. Before I leave, I will ask my first question. What are the experiences and lessons learned in implementing the PCI strategy to build a resilient landscape?
I'm a bit tall. Good morning. Thank you very much, and a lot for this kind introduction. And first of all, thank you very much for ISEAL, Billy, and Patrick for the invite, and also SourceUp and the Jurisdictional Action Network. It's a great pleasure to be here with you all, implementing these great jurisdictional programs all over the world. And let me start explaining really quickly about the PCI, the Produce, Conserve, Include strategy. It's a jurisdictional approach that was launched back in 2015 in the COP21, Paris, together with the Paris Agreement. So it's been now 10, almost 11 years of hard work. And it's very important to say that this work has been done with many, many partners. Some of them are here today with us. Some of them in the state government of Mato Grosso, and also local stakeholders in the landscapes where we work. So the PCI Institute has that role of leading and coordinating the action, but the work and the results are done with many stakeholders and partners all over the territory, and also in a global international perspective. To start, I think the first very relevant and important lesson we have is that the PCI back in 2015 decided a long-term land use plan for the state of Mato Grosso. And this plan was coordinated with the state government, with private sector, with producers, with farmers, and also with civil society. So I think that was the first, let's say, accomplishment of the strategy. And these are some numbers of this plan. So back in 2015, we had 63%, almost 64% of native vegetation, 22.4% of pasture, and 12.5% of agriculture, basically soy, corn, and cotton, and 1.2 of water surface. So as you can see, the plan is to reduce the area of pasture without reducing the number of cow heads, and also increasing the area of agriculture over degraded pasture. So that's the basic plan for the state. The native vegetation, we consider that in Brazil we have legal and illegal deforestation. So this reduction that we plan is basically for legal deforestation. But as you might know, there is a huge challenge in the Brazilian Amazon to reduce and curb illegal deforestation, which responds to 80 or 90% of the deforestation in the Amazon. In Mato Grosso, we have around 35% of legal deforestation and 65% of illegal deforestation. So the idea is that until 2030, we have zero illegal deforestation, and the legal deforestation that we have will be compensated with the restoration of liability. So that's how we are looking at 2030. That's the plan. Is very well aligned with the federal plan in the whole, with the federal government in the whole country of Brazil. So obviously there are many specific challenges on this journey, but that was the initial plan. And that initial plan was very important to define the roles of all the stakeholders that work together. And this is a result that Mato Grosso and also Brazil presented, that is a huge reduction on deforestation on the last 20 years. So in Mato Grosso specifically, we had around 90% of deforestation reduction, considering that Mato Grosso has Amazon forest and also our Brazilian savanna, Cerrado, and also a small part of, not that small, but around 12% of our Pantanal, which is the biggest wetland in the world. So it's very important to say that with that deforestation reduction, we also had an increase of 187% in soy production in the same period in the last 20 years. So it went from 18 million tons back in 2005 until 51 million tons of soy production. So it's very interesting how Mato Grosso managed to increase soy production, increase cattle head with the deforestation reduction. I think that's a very concrete result along the last 20 years that present really a business case of how increasing food production and reducing deforestation in the state. Obviously that this is also a very collective effort, especially on state government and federal government that are responsible for command and control and all the actions that reduce deforestation, and also farmers and private sector that have commitments that are doing their job, and also the work we do with governance, both in the high level but also in the local level. So on this next slide, I would like to bring this idea of how big Mato Grosso it is basically the size of Germany and France together. And this idea is that we have two approaches of work. One is on a jurisdictional level, working with the state government of Mato Grosso and with stakeholders in our capital. It's called Cuiabá. Down here, the yellow one. Let me see. Yeah, here. This is Cuiabá, our capital, where all the political decisions are made. And all these landscapes are what we call the Pactos PCI, or PCI compacts in English. And these are basically strategic and priority landscapes where we have very relevant supply chains, where we have company engagement, private sector engagement, civil society engagement, and governance groups working on specific goals in specific landscapes. So some landscapes produce more soy, some landscapes are more important in terms of beef production, and that's an approach that we do with the private sector based on the supply chains of the state. And the idea is that we started in a few municipalities with IDH support back in 2018, 2019, and now we expanded that to many other municipalities with many other partners. Some of them, as you see, started in only one municipality, and the idea is that we have a hub, a governance group, investments, companies, and that enables us to work in a larger scale. It's very important that once we go into a municipality, we have a local governance group there. But if we don't have projects, if we don't have investments, it's really hard to keep these stakeholders' engagement. So we have really to design projects and have real action on the ground, on restoration, on regenerative agriculture, on certification, on traceability, on all the actions that are needed for a DCF supply chain, so that we keep the stakeholders engaged. So this is the idea, and until 2030, we hope to have the whole state of Mato Grosso, 142 municipalities engaged. These are some pictures of the real action in terms of governance. So this is the high-level governance we have. This larger picture was preparation for COP30 in Brasília, in Brazil's capital. And so we have all the high-level stakeholders and partners, also some NGO partners, and companies, embassies from Norway, from Germany, from the UK that are very close partners from Mato Grosso, and also, of course, politicians and decision-making actors. All the other pictures is just to present how do we work in meetings, events, and monitoring the goals that we have with these stakeholders and finding out what are the goals that are advancing on track and what are the goals that we need a bigger attention to really make things happen until 2030. And these are some pictures of the local governance and actions on the ground. So I really wanted to bring some pictures for you to see how the strategy is being implemented. And you can imagine in a landscape on the size of Mato Grosso, and even in the specific landscapes where we work, we're talking about huge areas, but we have to do things on the ground to make the change. So that's the idea here, to bring some examples of restoration initiatives, regenerative agriculture initiatives, agroforestry initiatives, capacity building initiatives, meeting with mayors and local leaders, also with indigenous from the Xingu region in a municipality called Querência, other capacity building workshops, a lot of meetings, hundreds of meetings, alignment and engagement with all the stakeholders we work in these Pactos PCI. Some other regions, all those regions you saw in the map, these are the stakeholders that have the power to make decisions on the ground. That was to start, and thank you very much, Angela. That's
yes.
The second question.
Thank you, Richard. We have a few more questions for Richard, of course, but you can clap again after the second one. You already mentioned quite some interventions that have proven successful and the intent to scale them up to the whole of Mato Grosso. So what will it take to achieve that? And what is the role of innovative finance in that? Could you please elaborate? Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, I think we made a lot of progress in these, let's say, 10 years. But there's a lot of work to be done, as you can see, in the next 5 years. And I think the big challenge we have in the big picture is really to keep this 60% of native vegetation, advance on sustainability of these landscapes, and make it possible to increase agriculture production in all the commodities we have on the ground. And of course, that innovative finance play a very relevant role on that challenge. I'd like to start saying that I think that the first innovation that Brazil has been developing in a federal level is about Plano Safra. So Plano Safra is the main finance pipeline for farmers in Brazil. It's around $100 billion a year for farmers. But the thing is, how is that money being used? And in some cases, this money is also supporting deforestation. And so to have very specific environmental criteria into Plano Safra, I think is the first very important thing that the Brazilian government has been doing. Another innovation of the federal level comes from an initiative called EcoInvest. I think probably most of you have heard about it. And in EcoInvest, we are talking about around $15 billion of investments mobilized, of which 3 billion has been through operation. So just to compare how big Plano Safra is and how important Plano Safra is, but of course that EcoInvest with this blended finance initiative is also very relevant to really make it possible to finance in an innovative way how investors deal with risks and with investments on that scale. Yesterday, the Banco do Brasil, our national bank from Brazil, launched a very interesting initiative because EcoInvest is really addressing for very big farmers and big operations, but it's not addressing for medium and small size farmers and farms. And that's a very relevant action in terms of also reducing deforestation. So it was launched, implements SourceUp program, which is basically focusing on socio-bioeconomy supply chains in Brazil, which are very, very relevant for standing forest initiatives. There's also an initiative called the CCAT, Catalytic Capital for Agricultural Transition. We are also working in partnership with them to develop this innovative finance models in Mato Grosso with Vox Capital. And finally, we have the carbon projects, obviously. especially restoration carbon projects under the VCM, but also the jurisdictional REDD+ initiative. So Mato Grosso has been a pioneer in jurisdictional REDD initiatives. There's a state law from 2013. The law comes even before the PCI strategy. And we had the REDD Early Movers program with the support of Germany and the UK government. And it's been able to implement the first phase of the program, and now it's starting already the second phase of the program that goes from 2025 until 2029. And in parallel, Mato Grosso is also working on a jurisdictional approach, on a market-based jurisdictional approach with partners like Emergent, the LEAF Coalition, and other potential buyers that are very interested in high integrity carbon credits from the reduction of deforestation and degradation. And finally, I think that the big challenge here is how we manage to integrate DCF initiatives with private sector, jurisdictional REDD potential, and also carbon market and these blended finance initiatives, such as the EcoInvest, the CCAT, and other that we have on the ground. So besides making these initiatives work, I think it's very important also how we manage to make the integration. And I think the PCI plays an important role on getting these leaders together and how do we think of this finance really contributing to these 2030 goals.
Thank you, Richard. It's now we have time for, I would say, 2 quick questions from the audience. I have here Billy, who will ask the 2 questions at once to you, Richard, just to save some time, and great if you can shortly respond to them.
Okay. Yeah, and thank you to everyone that's put questions in through the Slido. I'm sorry we won't have time to get to all of them. We'll hopefully answer a few later on as well. Yeah, so 2 kind of, I think, main questions that have come up. So what governance structures have you put in place to ensure your actions are aligned with communities' priorities and visions? And how are you kind of measuring and monitoring the impact of these initiatives?
Very good questions. Well, first of all, as I presented on the slides, we have kind of 2 scales of governance. So we have a state level governance with high level partners, but also on those municipalities that were colored in the map, we have local governance groups in a municipal level. So in the municipal level, we talk to the mayor, we talk to the rural unions, to farmers, to indigenous, to smallholders associations, and we create this local governance group in these municipalities. So each municipality has one local governance group, and basically we have our team, our PCI team, has local partners that coordinate with these local governance groups, and we stay in Cuiabá coordinating this work in a state level. So it's a very connected governance structure on a municipal level, but also in the state level. In terms of monitoring the progress, we have a state level monitoring system. We have a monitoring committee with universities, NGOs, and private sector that work together monitoring these 2030 goals on annual basis. We are basically on track on most of them. I would say that the 2 biggest challenges we have to keep on track is to eliminate illegal deforestation until 2030. As I said, it's still 65% of deforestation, although Mato Grosso has a very good answer for deforestation alerts. It's around more than 80% of deforestation alerts have answers, which is very high rate for Amazon region, but it's still a very big challenge. And also land tenure issues, especially for smallholders. I would say that these are the 2 goals that we have that are the biggest challenges we have to keep on track until 2030. Also, the goals that we have for the CAR registry, which is the environmental management of the farms, are kind of far, but are moving very fast from the last 2 years with a system that we call the digital CAR. So to have an idea, in 10 years, we were able to validate 10% of the car registries in the state. And now with the digital system, we are almost in 30%. So it's been 20% advance in 2 and a little years, comparing to 10% in 10 years. So we expect that this will be able to advance until 2030. But obviously that the objective of the car registry is to restore liabilities. So also in the restoration agenda, we have a huge challenge to restore millions of hectares. And we're also working with implementation partners that have the expertise to implement restoration projects at scale. So that's another market opportunity, but also one of our goals. So we think that we are in a big picture on track, but there are some specific goals that we need to advance really quickly in the next 5 years so that we reach them all in 2030. And finally, we also have in the local governance groups, we have local goals that we built together in a participatory workshop with them. And the objective of these goals is that the local authorities and leaders, they really feel that these goals make sense for them. Because sometimes in a state level, in a jurisdictional level, it's too big and it's too far away for them. What does these goals mean? So we create also a structure of local goals together with them so that it makes sense in the municipal level. What are the goals for specific landscapes where we work?
That concludes our questions and answers. Thank you so much, Richard, for being here on stage and sharing your story.
Thank you.
Now we move on to our first panel discussion. I would like to invite on the stage our panel and our panel moderator, Marcela Paraños, who will further introduce the additional panelists. Marcela has a wealth of experience in building and implementing innovative finance solutions, both on the side of NGOs as well as from the investor side. She recently joined IDH as Director of Financial Markets. Marcela, it's a pleasure to put this panel discussion in your hands. The floor is yours. Yes, it's already booked.
Thank you, Anelot, and thank you all. I think it's very nice, especially speaking after Richard, that gives me great examples of everything that we will discuss in this panel. So, and today we will count here in this panel with a very good selection of different views to discuss a bit what is landscape finance and how can we land landscape finance concepts, but also practitioners on the ground and harmonize a bit the understanding and how we can move forward with these types of investments. So let me invite to stage right now Katie Kenrick from the Earth Foundation that will bring us the perspective of an organization that is on the ground implementing landscape finance initiatives. Welcome, Kate. Karen Moe from CERES that has recently launched a new study with CDP pointing out to the gaps and understandings of what landscape finance is really missing in terms of scaling. Welcome. Dr. Christopher Stewart from Olan Food Ingredients, that is a corporate, global corporate sourcing from these regions and practicing landscape using landscape initiatives as part of its policies. And finally, but also very important, let's welcome Paulina Villapalando from HSBC, that also cooperates in the series study and has a lot of track record and supporting landscapes in different ways. Welcome all. Thank you for being here. Let me just kick off with a very provocative sentence, but how can we think about landscape finance not as a specific type of investment, or as we call in the financial markets as an asset class, but let's think of this as a hub, as PCI created in Mato Grosso, that facilitates the financial flows from different actors from different angles to the same region. And this angle is what we will explore here with different visions. And let's see if in the end we have the answer to see how we can conserve 60% of the native vegetation of Mato Grosso and help the states to stop illegal deforestation. Because in the end, this is what we are looking for, ways and instruments that will create the real incentives on the ground for the decision-making points on land use. And these decision-making points are not only companies or governments. We are talking about millions of farmers on the ground taking decisions every day. So how can we use financial instruments and financial incentives for this? Let me start very quickly with Katie. O4 has spent over 2 decades working inside commodities production landscapes, the kind of landscapes that we are discussing here right now. So from your on-the-ground perspective, what a landscape initiative needs to have in order to create the right and correct environment for attracting investments, and what types of investments you are trying to attract in these landscapes?
Thank you. Hello? Okay, yes, that's working now. Thank you very much. So we run 16 landscapes globally. Most of those grew out of long-term... Oh, sorry, it's not close enough. Is that right? Sorry. I have normally a really loud voice anyway, so I spend most of my time trying to make my voice quieter. Earthworm runs 16 landscapes globally. Most of those grew out of long-term field engagement. Not all of them, but most of them did. And over the last 5 to 6 years, we've been formalizing them into landscapes at different levels of maturity. The focus in that time has been very much on protecting ecosystems and addressing salient human rights issues. And that's really important, but what we've realized is that isn't enough, that we can't protect the forests if the production systems around them are weak, unviable, or unproductive. So in the second phase, or in one case, one of our landscapes, the third phase, we have a lot more focus on the production systems. So in terms of what needs to be credible, I would say the first thing for us, and for many of the practitioners, is to have a really, really deep understanding of the context of what the issues are, and also the interconnectivity between those issues. I actually lead our human rights work, so I feel a little bit a little bit like an outsider here, because I know a lot of you sit on the environmental side, but understanding the difference and the connections between the social and the environmental issues is really, really important to lasting change. Knowing what the root causes of those things are, the barriers to change, and working, as Richard was saying, with local partners, local actors, with the communities and farmers who are involved in ensuring that we get a really good understanding. To identify the priority issues, but also to identify the capacity and the willingness to change. And all of that work, a lot of what Richard was talking about just now, happens before there's any measurable outcomes. And it requires a lot of upfront investment. And that is sometimes not really recognized. So part of our preliminary work is always, how do we fund the initial transition So the work that needs to happen now with farmers on the ground, and how do we make it sustainable long-term financially for them? The costs of implementing a regenerative system is incredibly high. Farmers are expected to deliver the outcomes, but often they just don't have the means to make those changes. Companies can't afford to carry all of that cost alone. And the reality is, in many regions, there are still economic incentives for unsustainable practices. And if we don't address that, transition isn't going to happen. So I'll say that's the first part. To the second part, in terms of the challenges we see, or what we see as mistakes, I think the biggest one, and I know we're going to talk about this later, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, but I think the biggest one is the assumption that these issues can be addressed individually. Landscapes are interconnected systems. Financing often comes in silos, as does KPIs, measurements, and often the teams we talk to. And it's normal that a funder's going to have priorities. Bringing together different thematics is hard. We know that as an organization. I joined EF 10 years ago with the mandate to increase our work on human rights. And at the time, everyone was claiming there were no labor issues in palm oil. The Amnesty report hadn't come out yet, that really the social issues were just linked to land. And actually, it's come a long, long way. But it is really, really hard for everybody to break down those silos and to break down the interests. Carbon's a good example. It's excellent, but it doesn't capture the full value of what's needed. It doesn't capture what the landscapes are delivering necessarily in terms of biodiversity, ecosystems, resilience, and social outcomes. So we're looking in places like the landscape we run in Rio at how we can better value and finance those other elements, help people understand what those elements are and why they're important. Incidentally, there's a lot more funding available for carbon than there is for human rights issues. It's quite hard to find funding on some of those topics, but there is a link between a farmer's capacity to farm and delivering on the carbon agenda as well. So I think one of the challenges to organizations like ours is to design programs and finance structures that bring together those different things. I think we have a responsibility there as well. And all of this is very highly context specific. It quickly gets really, really complicated. I think we alluded at the beginning to the different types of funding that goes into this. That kind of financial engineering is important. It is not our core strength. So we work with other partners like Finance Earth and others on designing that. Overall, I would say there's a real need to be patient. That early work is really, really messy, but it's really critical. It needs to be funded, and there needs to be a willingness to look at it all. So I say we don't have all of the answers, but we are trying to find some of the solutions, and we recognize the need to build from a really, really solid foundation.
Thank you so much, Kate. And looking to what you are doing and understanding the context and the communities on the ground and etc. And back to my previous hat, sitting on an investment fund that uses jurisdictional approaches as part of the entering point in each region that it will invest. It's very important to understand this context and being able to internalize this to our investment decisions. Of course, it has its ways of doing this, but without this lens and without a minimum knowledge of what's happening on the ground, we are not able to de-risk our investments over time. So when we talk about investing in deforestation-free landscapes or creating deforestation-free commodities, if we don't have these landscape initiatives on the ground to support with PCI, for more than 16 landscapes, 65 landscapes, I'm sorry. If we don't have this, it's very hard just to, with public policy to achieve and keep these goals and keep this investment level for each region. So thank you for your work. Moving to the finance part, but HSBC is both a funder of the Finance for Resilience Landscape Program and a financial institution who lends to companies working in these landscapes and working with your clients to improve the financial flows to these landscapes. So from where you sit, we would like to explore how to connect investors, business, communities through these products, and what you see as the financial instruments or structures that the bank can use or is in power of shaping for directing private capital into these landscapes. And how are the ways you can do this as a bank?
Difficult question. How's everyone doing? It's pretty hot in here. Thanks for inviting me, and very happy to be here with other colleagues. I mean, HSBC is present in more than 60 markets around the world, so we are in a very privileged position to connect different regions and different stakeholders across huge supply chains. But I'll tell you a bit more about our program first, and then maybe we'll go into the financing mechanism. So Finance for Resilient Landscapes is a new program that we set up. It's philanthropic with ProForest, Conservation International, and the Nature Conservancy. And the idea is to accelerate and scale nature finance, but we're using landscape and jurisdictional initiatives as our kind of starting point for doing that. So the big problem, obviously, is deforestation, biodiversity loss. But we're also seeing other problems with nature finance, which is that a lot of that finance is starting to trickle down, but it's quite small. And normally projects like carbon projects, for example, that are not necessarily linked to these productive landscapes and are not delivering the impact and the scale that we're looking for. So what we're trying to do is basically help these landscapes turn into landscapes that depend very heavily on CSR budgets from these companies that are sourcing from them, or from philanthropic interventions into landscapes that can receive more finance in a commercial way so that are investable. So we're working in 6 landscapes. So it's a global program, but we're working in 6 landscapes, 2 in Indonesia focused in palm oil, and 4 in Brazil focused on cattle and soy. And I think a key point is just saying that we're not starting from scratch. The idea is to build on all of these landscape initiatives, mature landscapes, so that we can, accelerate the action and not necessarily reinvent the wheel. So the types of interventions that we're looking at is, how can we protect and restore forests or other natural areas? How can we improve watershed protection, address issues like fire, flooding, etc., to make these landscapes and food production there more resilient, and also reduce risks that are now starting to materialize as financial risk for us as banks. So in terms of financial instruments, I think the transition, nature positive and climate transition of these landscapes is looking kind of similar to the energy transition. It's maybe a bit further back, but it's a mix of instruments, right? So we're looking at instruments that can de-risk. Philanthropy obviously plays a huge role, but we're also starting to see, there are other instruments that could play a big role in risk sharing, such as blended finance, etc. So the way we're seeing it is landscapes are not necessarily an asset class. So we're not looking at an entity that we can come in and invest in. I think that would be the dream, I think, but it's pretty impossible given the amount of stakeholders that are in these landscapes and the different needs that they have. So we're looking more at, a suite of interventions that could support resilience in these landscapes. So, for example, who is best placed to come in and support finance for smallholders? Who is best placed to come in and support a carbon project in a big forest that is in that landscape? And maybe that's not a role that HSBC can play, but maybe that is a role that maybe venture capital can play or other types of financial institutions. So what we're trying to see is, with our partners in these 6 landscapes as our testing ground, what are the finance flows that are going there? Because a lot of these landscapes have financial flows going there, either in the way of traditional finance, like loans that we give to our corporate clients, or through government funding, or through CSR or philanthropic grants. What is the nature that needs to be protected and restored in these landscapes to make them more resilient? And then what kind of financial institution is best placed to meet those financial needs? So I guess just in general, in terms of nature finance for landscapes, I think there are 2 big buckets. So the finance in green, which is basically direct interventions and flows of capital that are supporting restoration and protection on the ground. So a good example of that is an outcome bond that we did in Brazil a couple of years ago, where we worked with the World Bank, Microsoft, and a company called Momback, where we structured this whole outcome bond to support restoration, and where the main income stream was carbon credits. So that's a very good example of financing green. Maybe that kind of structure could work for some landscapes where we're working in, maybe not. We're also starting to see lots of new exciting mechanisms. And this is kind of the part where you're seeing more innovation. WRI is working very closely with others and natural asset corporations. Like maybe that's something that works in these landscapes, potentially worth testing through this program. And then we have the other kind of bucket of financing, which is traditional financing. So greening financial flows going into these landscapes. So what finance is flowing through our corporate loans? Are we linking that finance necessarily to the outcomes of these landscapes? Maybe not, and maybe there's a huge potential there. And I would argue that a bank like HSBC has the biggest role to play in that bucket. And a good example of that is a sustainability-linked loan. So we did one with Musimas a couple of years ago, where the KPIs of that loan were very linked to deforestation action on the ground, training smallholders, supporting RSPO certification. So not all finance needs to be super innovative and new and groundbreaking. A lot of things can be done through existing relationships with these corporate clients. I guess the key point is all of the banks should be doing it. And also there's a big need for local and regional banks to also step up and work with us in these areas.
Thank you so much, Paulina. And I think we have great examples here now in terms of how a financial institution can directly support a landscape initiative in terms of creating the right environment, bringing the right actors with different types of support to attend the specific demands and the specific needs of these landscapes. But more important, how you can greening the financial flows going to these landscapes as a bank through your clients and through the supply chains that they work with. So thank you for the examples. And moving to Karen, Ceres recently launched a new study where one of the data is that, let me have a look at here, but nearly half of the major companies in CDP right now disclosure that they have some involvement in landscape initiatives. But from the involvement to the real financial flows behind this involvement and to increase the support, this active support, we are still missing a lot. So we still have a huge gap there. So my question to you is, is this a translation problem? Where is the real gap behind? And what are the barriers for investors to engage companies on landscape investment within their value chains? What they are missing and what we can improve, what we can give them to improve these flows?
Thank you for the question. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. And thank you everyone for being here. I know you've got a lot of places you could be, including air-conditioned coffee shops. So thank you so much. Well, and I'm really excited to be here. This is a question that is very near and dear to my own heart. But before that, very quickly, for those of you who may not know, Ceres is a nonprofit advocacy organization that we work in the intersection of financial institutions, in particular the institutional investors, corporates, and policymakers, to try to really mainstream the issue of sustainability as a part of the business and trying to advocate for greater transparency and accountability, and trying to really advance solutions towards more resilient and sustainable global economy. So when we think about the role of institutional investors, and I think it's really important for us to also understand that there's different tools in different investors' toolbox that they can use. Paulina mentioned some of these that the bank might have. And for a lot of the investors that we work with, these are asset owners and asset managers that invest in companies in the public stock market. So for these investors, their primary, if not the sole responsibility, is to ensure the value, to protect the value of their asset and to grow the value of the assets that they own and manage for their clients and for their beneficiaries. And what that actually means is that they need to understand the risks that are within their portfolio companies, and to be able to engage with those companies to address those risks, as well as those opportunities that they might have. And there's a very different kind of instruments that the bank might have in terms of engaging with their companies. So when we started doing this work to think about how can we really leverage this stewardship as a tool to drive a more value chain finance into these landscapes, well, we quickly realized that most of the investors we talked to have no idea what a landscape initiative even is, or why it really matters. And this is really puzzling to many of us who in this room been working on this for decades or more. And companies are in fact disclosing a lot of that information to CDP in their sustainability report. So we kind of looked into what's actually missing, and that's why we published a report last week to really outline some of the business case for investors and as well as the engagement framework for them. And there are a couple of things that I wanted to highlight. The first is that what we found is a lot of the companies are actually not really clearly showing how is that the investment in the landscape is tied to their core business strategy and their goals. So whether the goal being, halting deforestation or climate or nature. To give an example, most of the companies don't actually disclose the percentage of their sourcing from a lot of the landscapes that they invest. There are some exceptions. We found, for example, Nestle, they're investing in the landscape in Malaysia from which they're sourcing about 8% of their palm oil. And those are the kind of information the investors really need. And because that's what's going to tell the investor how is the company actually using that as an investment as a way to really manage and reduce their risk. But that is a pretty rare type of information. So that's one thing. And the second thing that is, there's very little context often in terms of what investors are seeing from the company's disclosure. So one investor actually told us the companies are really good at telling the story about their nominators, but not the denominators. So, they might say we're supporting 700 smallholders, but 700 out of like how many within their, supply base. And those are, without that information, it's kind of hard to gauge the materiality of a lot of these engagement that the companies have. And the last thing I will just say is that, most of the investors, if not all of them, don't actually know the potential impact that these landscape initiatives have as a driver of either risk mitigation or as a driver of value creation for the companies and within their portfolio. And what I mean is that, when an investor identifies, potential risk, and what they're looking for is performance metrics that can help them understand how the companies are actually managing those risks and are and so, if you think about deforestation, those metrics could be percentage of DCF, deforestation conversion-free sourcing, could be percentage of, sources traceable to the farm, et cetera. But, that's actually very difficult, right, for the initiatives individually, but also collectively. And this is not really just an issue for the initiatives, for the, landscape initiatives. It's a challenge that we actually have come up against a lot in our nature-related conversation, the human rights-related conversation with investors and trying to engage companies on these topics. And a related challenge is also around the how do you then know what good looks like, what the end goal should look like. And it's hard enough for the individual companies to be able to add up the different investments, roll them up to tell a coherent story. And it's really hard for investors that have maybe 10, 20, 100 companies in their portfolio to really know how all this investment is going to add up in terms of the overall impact that they can have on their portfolio and how that's actually relevant for the company's business. So those are some of the gaps and challenges that we see and through our research. So.
Thank you so much, Karen. And you actually brought a very strong and how can I say, immediate factor to this discussion, that is risk mitigation. When we look from the private capital angle, it can be an investor that needs to protect its assets. It can be a company that needs more reliability in terms of sourcing in the long run. We need to look on the ground in terms of what's happening around this company. It can be with forest communities around the operations, so the integration with the local actors. that will actually impact their own capacity in the medium and long run to continue to source, to continue to produce in this region. So the risk part is the first one that we can incorporate in our analysis when we are looking for new investments in these regions. And this is also the one that is easier to translate to balance sheets and to actually things that we can monetize and we can pricify nowadays. So thank you for the contribution. And moving to Christopher with OFI. And OFI has more sources right now from more than 2.6 million farmers around the globe in very, how can I say, fragmented supply chains as cocoa, coffee, and other smallholder crops. Is sitting from a very inside the very landscape that this panel is talking about. So all these impacts actually will come out in your daily work. And from your position, what does investing in landscape looks like for OFI, and how these investments translate to traceable and tradable climate benefits, and what are the barriers preventing these investment flows to scale? And let's just bring this to an angle that investments not putting money in these landscapes, but is much more around how the company is shaping their sourcing strategies and all the programs around these regions to secure your sourcing.
Thank you. So, sorry. Does it work? Does it work? Okay, thank you. So OFI is a global company sourcing cocoa, coffee, nuts, spices, and dairy from over 40 countries. We set out our Choices for Change strategy in 2024, aiming to reach 1 million farmers in our programs, supported by livelihood programs by 2030, and to have 20 landscape partnerships in place. That was before a certain president destroyed certain major landscape funding international bodies. So there are headwinds, but we do have 10 landscapes with active programs at the moment, and fortunately we have found alternative funding for that. Last year we had 570,000 farmers in our program, so a very substantial number of large programs with many of our customers. So our customers are global brands and retailers who obviously use those products in their own branded products. So talking about landscapes, and I want to be a little, I think companies don't understand landscapes at all well. Companies, if you start talking about landscapes, they will nod, they will be supportive, but really kind of it's glazing over inside, right? If you want to talk about what's important to companies, it's the strategically important supply chains, supply sheds, and suppliers, right? That's how you conceive of important areas, right? For an ecologist, a landscape is around the geography, around communities, potentially around the economy. But for companies, it's really about your supply chain and how do you secure long-term security of supply. So we've had some success over the last 10 years in working with a variety of partners on landscape programs. And we're not the only ones who have landscape commitments. So within our sector, just to cite PepsiCo, Mars, Lindt, Nestle, Hershey, Ecom, Lavazza, Barry Callebaut, Volcafe, all have landscape commitments. A few of those companies actually have a framework and metrics, but far from all really have set out how they plan to invest strategically in landscapes. We have partnerships with a number of those companies. They are serious about investing in security of supply. And just to give you a couple of examples, Nestle and OFI embarked on a long-term partnership to support 25,000 farmers across 3 countries, Nigeria, Cote d'Ivoire, and Brazil, and plant 2.8 million trees. That was announced last year. We've just signed a pilot phase of a new program with Mars, which is a fantastic project in Ecuador, supporting about 1,000 farmers that will be scaled up, and that's looking at agroforestry, regenerative agriculture, crop residue management, etc. I think the common feature of all of these programs that we have is that our customers and ourselves want to be able to demonstrate an impact and a return on investment. And that, I think, is where the real challenge is for landscape scale investments. So although a lot of companies are making positive noises about landscapes, I think they have been soft pedaling or rowing back the scale of investment on things like forest protection and forest conservation that 10 years ago or even 5 years ago, they were embarking on much more actively. In our sector, again, with our commodities, over the last few years, we've had a huge amount of investment in traceability because of EUDR. Effectively, when EUDR came in and companies learned that they were, at risk of fines of up to 4% of their global turnover if they had deforestation-linked commodities coming into the EU, suddenly, we all found the money to do traceability back to the farm in incredibly complex landscapes. And that has been a massive sector-wide effort. Does it stop deforestation? I would say doubtful, right? Because actually, if you exclude deforestation-linked farmers from your supply chains, what happens to their farms, right? They can't sell their product to you, so they may sell it through a back route to somebody else and hope to get it through, bulk it up in somebody else's supply chain, or they may turn to another commodity. They'll turn from cocoa, whatever, to cassava because they can actually no longer access global supply chains. And with that, they can no longer access programs. They probably don't have any extension services for those programs. So actually, the traceability, although it's been a fantastic in terms of understanding and de-risking corporate supply chains, actually doesn't have the necessary impact on halting and remediating deforestation at scale. That's my belief. The second thing is with this, that because companies have been focused on science-based targets largely and on reducing our carbon footprint, our carbon inventory, we can't count landscape carbon conservation within our inventory, right? The rules are very clear on that at the moment, which means that actually, and rightly so, we've been focused on decarbonizing our supply chains. That means regenerative agriculture programs, agroforestry, crop residue management, inputs management, etc. And we can measure that and we can quantify that and we can verify that and we can pass that benefit down the supply chain. If you're doing forest conservation, investing in forest restoration, that's great, but it's a philanthropy. It's beyond the value chain. And not a lot of companies are doing this at scale now. So coming to the barriers, I believe that one of the things that we need to work on collectively is to find a coupling mechanism, which is allowed under the land sector removals standard, where we consider that farmers and forests or ecosystems within one landscape are effectively coupled systems, right? And then you have to devise a mechanism whereby the companies rightfully invest in decarbonizing farms and supply chains and making those more sustainable and implementing agroforestry where you can, etc. But as part of a financing mechanism that also invests in restoring and protecting forests. And I believe that the mechanism that should work here is that you allocate benefits to the farmers participating in a scheme proportionate to the reductions that they're able to achieve, right? And there would be financial benefits for farmers. So companies and farmers focus on decarbonizing supply chains and avoiding deforestation. Donor money and national development money goes into restoring, protecting forests. And the participants in that scheme all have a win-win in achieving a positive carbon impact. And where that becomes important is that that carbon impact could be passed down the value chain to the customers, to the big brands, to the retailers, to reduce their carbon footprint overall, much more and much more cheaply, importantly, than you could do just on farm alone. And I'm very passionate about this because I think that it's a mechanism that is geared to bringing money and into stabilizing and into visible supply chains, so it actually creates some loyalty of some of those companies towards these high value nature-friendly, carbon-friendly supply chains. And we know today that companies are willing to pay for carbon. It's yet to be proved that they're willing to pay for other ecosystem services at scale. So this is a totally achievable thing with a slight tweak to the rules that we have today. And for us at OFI, our next steps on this is to demonstrate the use case. So we've been doing some work with the Boa Vista consultancies, some of whom are sitting in this room, on understanding our landscapes, our critical sustainable supply chains, doing that boundary mapping, look at the metrics, looking at land use and land cover change, to be able to quantify and provide test cases for this concept of a coupled mechanism for smallholders and forest action within the same landscapes. Right, that's it.
Thank you so much, Christopher. And thank you for bringing the lens of actually a very good provocation that I see here. And I really support that many times we will invest in traceability, we will invest in many factors to de-risk, especially when we talk about reputational risk and not specifically the sourcing. But not necessarily all these efforts will translate in reduced deforestation in the end of the day. So the types of support that we need from the landscape angle, and this is something that we discuss a lot in IDH. Many times we built these supports from a north-south lens, looking to traceability. And I used to say that traceability is not a farmer problem. The farmer knows where his cattle is. The traceability is a problem for who is consuming here in Europe. So how can we look to the landscape, landscapes and how to invest in improving lives there? From the bottom-up perspective, looking to what is really needed for each individual choices in the end of the day to stop deforestation. Thank you for this, and also agree with you that philanthropy is not scalable. So how can we transform these financial flows and sourcing strategies and everything that is connected commercially to this landscape into a more sustainable model? We only have a bit more than 10 minutes left, so I will propose a slightly change. I will make one general question to you, and I ask in one or two phrases your view on this, so we have time for questions from the audience. So let's shift a bit for something that is populating more and more in our discussions when we talk about landscapes, that's resilience. And as you corrected, brought the concept of the coupled systems, when we look to landscapes, we don't have separate systems. We don't have a forest here, a farm there, and an ecosystem elsewhere. Is everything the same? And what happens to the smallholders will affect yield, will affect the watersheds. What happens to the watersheds will affect productivity. And what happens to the ecosystem will also affect the credit risk of that farmer to the bank that will support him in the end. So looking at this, my general question for all of you is, from where you sit, what does resilience mean in practice? Very quickly. What would you take for the integrated reality to be translated in the way resilience is priced and financed? Because this is a very hard thing to translate resilience to finance. And what would you take for those outcomes to show up credibly in corporate risk assessment or portfolio analysis? You don't need to respond them all. Pick one you prefer and give us a very quick 1 or 2 sentences.
I've got the mic, so I'll just start. So I think for us, speaking, from a corporate perspective, resilience in our business means having security of supply in these strategic areas. So being able to source reliable volumes of raw materials with stable long-term suppliers over the long term. And that means effectively that you're buffering against some of the shocks, the price shocks, the climate shocks, disease shocks that we see in all of these agricultural commodities. What does this resilience look like in practice? Well, I've talked about it a little bit. What we know is that, you know, regenerative agriculture, soil health, etc., are key to the agricultural resilience. We also know from a sort of an economic resilience perspective that our customers aren't really interested in paying for regenerative agriculture for its own sake or resilience for its own sake. They want measurable outcomes. And I think that's why we have to crack the carbon nut as a key component of that resilient system. And I think that should be our focus for the next few years, actually incorporate carbon within resilience for smallholder supply chains and make sure that we get that right. It's incorporating it into market mechanisms, not just programs which only have a limited reach. Thank you.
Hello? Okay, right. Okay, for us, very broadly, resilience means farmers that stay in farming, land that keeps producing, and systems that are capable of absorbing shocks. We're working in these geographies with those farmers, so we have quite a practical approach to that. Just a couple of points. I think it's what that means on a farm means renewing aging trees. It means agroforestry systems. It's also, we have a problem with aging trees not being very productive. We also have a problem with aging farmers. In our project in Thailand, the average age of the farmer is 50. There is, as I mentioned earlier, not necessarily the right economic incentives. I agree with a lot of what you said on carbon. I would also say the payments for carbon are really low. It is not necessarily in the farmer's interest, and we have to, A, understand that, and B, figure out a way of resolving the economic issue right the whole way through the supply chain, so the motivation is there. In terms of how we get there, I think we all need to be talking a lot more. We need to be understanding each other's perspectives from the different, right from the banks all the way down the supply chain to the farmers. And we need to be trying to speak the same language. I know you mentioned that earlier. We all talk far too much in acronyms, far too much in technical language. I went through my notes yesterday and took out every single technical term because I realized how uncomfortable I was with a lot of it. And a lot of these things sound very, very complicated, and there is a huge amount involved. It is complex, but lots of the ideas aren't actually. They're quite simple. And so if we were able to be kind to each other and speak in simple terms, I think that would help a lot.
So I'm just going to build on the two key things that the previous speakers very much agree with Christopher, but also just build on that resilience. Also, you can extend that to the entire, at the corporate level, you know, from an investor standpoint, if a company can do their business more efficiently and they can manage their risk more effectively, and they're better prepared for any kind of current or future, you know, disclosure, regulatory requirements, or stakeholder expectations, they are going to be more competitive in the marketplace in the long run. And that is translates to the resilience. Investors are looking at that across the portfolio that they own. And so that is actually very important, not just for the individual supply chain, but for the entire company, and how they can withstand the type of market volatility that we see, and that we will increase to see in the context of the climate change. And also really important, I think, in terms of what would be needed, I would almost argue that it's not so much of a more data collection on the ground. It's also about how we're harmonizing the information from the different initiatives of building what Katie was saying about, you know, we need to talk to each other to really align the languages, to be able to harmonize the information so they can be added, can be aggregated, can be, you know, really translated into the type of languages that investors will be able to understand in terms of, you know, price, in terms of the costs, you know, that sort of things. So those are some of my comments.
I feel like everyone said what I wanted to say. So for banks, it's mostly risk reduction, right? So not just reputational risk, which we tend to talk about a lot, but also, you know, the ability of a company to be able to repay a loan. So if you have a huge flood, like we had in Aceh recently, you know, companies that were affected may be a bit strained and couldn't maybe repay a loan, on top of many other things, including
the financial institutions like increased focus on the convergence between financial crime and environmental crime, looking at things like illegality, which then bled into, corruption, fraud. So there's a lot more attention, not just on reputational risk and climate risk and financial risk, but also in like legal risks that are affecting both companies and financial institutions. So I guess for us, resilience means reducing all of these risks as much as possible, the ability of companies to access and repay credit, and also access insurance, which no one is really talking about. And all of these risks are affecting the ability to get insurance and therefore the ability to get finance. So I guess how do we materialize into the P&L or like the balance sheet of companies and financial institutions? I think it's more about, I think Christopher said something really important, which is quantification. Like, how can we quantify that the cost of inaction in a landscape is more expensive than doing something about it? How can we show that regenerative agriculture is resulting in better yields? How can we turn that into numbers that then financial institutions can understand? How can landscape metrics, how can they mirror or align with TNFD LEAP assessments, which financial institutions and companies are looking at? So like speaking the same language, I think is really crucial. And I guess another big one is these are sectors that haven't traditionally talked to each other very much. So speaking the same language, but also sitting together to really figure out these challenges, which we're trying to do through the partnership. And also mirroring the level of collaboration that Christopher and others were mentioning. Like, companies have been working with each other for a really long time in these landscapes. Financial institutions are not sitting together and figuring out how we support collectively all of these companies that are in these landscapes, right? You don't have the relationship manager of a Nestle, a Unilever, and an Olam or OFI sitting together to figure out how we support all of them in one go. We're having individual conversations with all of these different companies, which is really inefficient and not very strategic. So yeah, that would be my suggestion. And then banks are also really reactive to what companies ask for. So if we get a company saying, we want finance for this landscape, this is what we need, and we're bringing together a few others, figure something out for us, the banks will do it. But we're not necessarily the best at approaching companies with new and innovative ideas.
Thank you so much. And actually bringing a different angle that all of you were very well did very well, because we are not talking here about resilience in terms of production practices or etc. We are talking about bankability, efficient risk management, resilient supply over time, and all these factors that are so important. I think the cost of inaction is a very strong point that we need to actually start to monetize this and bring to the present value in our decision-making process. It's not easy to do. And it's very nice to see that the bank is looking to financial crimes connected to environmental crimes. Is a huge step to stop the illegal deforestation and maybe help Mato Grosso. And but it's very nice. Do we still have time for a round of Q&A? Okay, so we can start with the questions from the audience.
Oh. Hello. Okay, we're good. Thank you. Yes, so we've had quite a few questions through Slido. So I'm just going to start on the first one with carbon being a very central agenda and priority. How are we convincing financing sectors to think more broadly beyond that to social and deforestation impact? And I don't know, well, I think we've heard a little bit about the carbon tie from Christopher as well. I don't know, Karen, from the finance sector perspective, or Paulina, if you want to jump in. Oh, sorry. So with carbon being a very central agenda and priority, how can we convince the finance sector to look more broadly towards deforestation and social impacts? So what is the, I guess, maybe it links as well. There's another question in terms of where do corporates get their return on investment in landscapes programs? So I think, how can we speak the language of corporates to care about the wider topic issues rather than just through the language of carbon?
Maybe I can help to redirect, because our panelists already brought very nice points here, and also using carbon as a key element. We are discussing resilience, but let's look to carbon as a coin, a type of translation of impacts that are translated into carbon. You have many ways to do this. Of course, these coins, much as US dollars, are much more recognized and accepted over there. But what we can do to bring other elements to this this flow that carbon is now occupying?
I can give it a go. Just a general kind of reflection that I've had over the last couple of years 3 years as a banker. I think the key issue with carbon, particularly in landscapes, is that a lot of the forests that we need to protect in these landscapes are not owned by anyone. So if you think about the MOMBAC outcome bond that we did in Brazil, that was a perfect scenario. You had the World Bank, Microsoft was going to buy the carbon credits. We had the entrepreneurs on the ground called MOMBAC, highly educated, really, good at PowerPoint decks. They were able to access the market, get the finance that they needed. The land was private, right? So you have a very kind of a sweet spot where you can implement a project on the ground. It's a single owner. You have the off-taker, you have the bank coming in, the World Bank as well. So in landscapes, that's really not the case in most cases. So I think the nut that we need to crack is really how do we bring in these forests that are maybe community owned, that don't have these like structures, and then see what else we can stack on top of that. So carbon is an income stream. Could we maybe bring in other types of income streams? Bioeconomy is a big topic right now. Could we look into, biodiversity credits at some point? So it's not that easy in these landscapes, I think, which is why we're trying to figure out what the right structures are.
Yes, and we also have, on top of all the efforts from the private sector with MOMBACs and other companies in terms of driving investments using carbon, we have the jurisdictional programs in carbon as well that are much more able to crowd in all the impacts and effects of a landscape into one piece of carbon, one unit of carbon. So I think this is a combination. And it's very nice to have the private capital moving into this.
Yeah, so one other question that's coming in is how can the need for supply chain resilience by corporates be leveraged to finance systematic change in landscape? So I think we're hearing about what this resilience business case was for you all, and how does that really translate? Is it being well recognized that the potential risks to sourcing in a landscape is translating into that investment in landscape programs?
Well, so I can't speak for the investors, obviously, but when we're talking about our resilient supply chains and suppliers, that means implementing programs where we have people on the ground, and whether other corporates might have different systems and deliver through technical assistance and local partners, but all of the companies in our sector are doing something like this. Now, as I mentioned, I think at the moment there's a big missing piece of this, which is that everybody is focused on what's happening on the farm and not enough focused on what's happening beyond the farm. And we need to consider these, the ecosystems within landscape boundaries as a coupled system. And that requires bringing together stakeholders locally. I mean, we heard about the governance system in Mato Grosso. We've been doing similar things in Ghana with land management boards. You bring people together and you create a vision of what the future could look like, which then becomes investable. And for us, it's investable in that we can put money into programs because we have a sort of a governance system that allows us to do that. For the investors in other aspects, I still believe that the strongest single market signal is around carbon removals and carbon reductions, and there are companies that can't really get around that in terms of credits. So let's create systems which produce sustainable foods and store increasing amounts of carbon, and the excess carbon can go and benefit companies that aren't sitting within that particular supply chain. But the companies that are working within that landscape and supply chain should be focused on that coupled system.
Maybe I'll just build up really quickly. Sorry, I misinterpreted your signal. I thought you wanted to. So from my perspective, I've, in the last few years that we've been working with investors, one thing that I learned is that if it's too complex, then people just kind of fall back to what they know and their metrics that they know. And I think the complexity is certainly one of the challenges that I mentioned earlier. So more streamlining of that, and to the extent that we can actually pack a lot of outcomes into a single metric like carbon, that's actually all the better. So then we know that it's not just about the carbon sequestration, but it's actually encompasses all these other benefits. I think that's where a lot of the investors ended up falling back to what they actually know, whether it's a risk or it's the climate or deforestation, and we are trying to really figure out how to bring that landscape into those conversations. And that's why I also think that the maturity metrics that the ISEAL Alliance kind of and the practitioners community develop is really useful. So one of the investors actually came to us after the report. They asked, well, tell me how many initiatives this company needs to invest in order for them to actually adequately mitigate their risk. We can ask that, 5, 10, 20, those are the kind of things we get asked a lot by the investors. And I think, to the extent that we can say, here's the type of initiatives that you need to look for in the company's disclosure in order to know that there's all these other benefits that are and the safeguards are packed within that. I think that those are the really powerful points.
Thank you so much. I think we are out of time. So I appreciate your participation here today. And thank you for the very good insights and experiences and that you brought to us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marcela and panelists. I found this very interesting and enlightening. I hope you did too. We also noticed the room is heating up, so it is definitely time for a break. We will break until 11:35 CET, also for the people online. Please feel free to leave the room. There are refreshments outside. Make sure to drink plenty of water. Venture into the garden. There is a hall with air conditioning. We see you back at 11:35. Thank you. Hello, everyone. I see most of us are still enjoying their breaks. I would kindly ask for everyone to sit down and calm down, hopefully cool down, or hopefully you have already cooled down a little bit. Because I would like to start the second part of our event. Thank you. So welcome back, everybody in the room and online. I hope you had a refreshing break. I see a lot of waving movements. I had a conversation with somebody. He was to blame for all the heat. So if you want to be angry at somebody, he's sitting right over there. But I'm sure we have a very interesting and exciting panel ahead that will make you completely forget about the heat here, I'm sure. It is my pleasure to welcome to the stage the moderator of our second and last panel, Patrick Mallet. He's the Director, Credibility and Innovations at ISEAL. Patrick leads ISEAL's efforts to ensure the effectiveness of sustainability systems and to support them to meet evolving stakeholder expectations. He's been involved in ISEAL's landscape work for over 6 years, and he is universally regarded for his ability to build bridges and bring clarity. So, Patrick, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Anna-Lotte. So I just want to start by saying how impressed I was with the first panel. I really felt like this isn't just a superficial conversation, but one that is recognizing some of the constraints as well as the opportunities of engaging in landscape initiatives. I want to bring up our panelists. I'll bring them up just in the order that they're there. So Akiva Fishman is the Director of Nature-Based Solutions at WWF US. Tom Hegarty is the Technical Director and leads of Transition Planning and Targets at Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. I suppose strategically I should have started at the other end. Anna Lima is Partnerships Director at Rainforest Alliance Accountability Framework. And Rachel Vujovich is the Director of International Sustainability at Aldi Sud. So please give a warm welcome to our panelists. So the context for this conversation is quite similar to the one previously, but I'd like to dig into some of the details in a bit more practical, how do we move forward kind of way. And in doing that, I really want to stress the importance of recognizing the growth in interest in landscape initiatives, taking the caveats we heard in the first panel about the need to have quantified impact data to be able to speak to the questions of resilience of supply chains. But I took away one of the last comments about the cost of inaction and really recognizing that this isn't just a zero-sum game, but the lack of investment also then speaks to the risks in the supply chain. And Rachel, I want to start with you. Coming from Aldi Sud, I mean, maybe initially you can just talk a little bit about what drove your company's interest in landscape initiatives, and whether that's or how that's evolved over the last couple of years, just recognizing how important resilience has become as a driver for investment.
Yeah, thank you so much. And just to make sure, in case you're not aware, Aldi South is a global food retailer. So we have a substantial presence in the EU, but also we have markets outside the EU, most notably the US, Australia, the UK, China. And so everything we're looking at needs to be thought of in terms of the strategic direction for our whole group, which is a very diverse set of markets that it needs to work for. So when it came to kind of our journey towards prioritizing investment in landscapes, it all came down to the fact that, again, we're a global food retailer and we're a discount food retailer, meaning what we provide to our customers, we want it to be high quality, we want it to be sustainable, but we want it to stay very affordable. So we're not in a position where we can pass on, or that we would want to pass on, a lot of the costs that we would then have in terms of investment into our value chain for what we want to achieve strategically. Nevertheless, we do recognize long-term, and I know this was a point that was made in the panel previously, right? It's about recognition that this does align with our strategic goals. And as a food retailer, we depend on agriculture. Agriculture depends on intact landscapes. So in order to really make sure we have long-term access and we have some degree of resiliency in these critical commodities, we recognize that we have to have this dual approach. We have to think about activities on farm, working with our suppliers, and we have to think about the landscapes more broadly. Maybe as a final point, as a retailer, we're kind of all the way at the end of the chain there. So our ability to have certain leverage upstream, our ability to have traceability is quite limited. So we need to think in terms of bigger supply sheds. We need to think in terms of collective action in order to still progress those areas where it's still reasonable to assume that we are going to be pulling and we are dependent on that ultimately.
And is that action that you're taking individually as a company? Are you talking with other companies? how does it practically work to think about investing beyond the supply chain?
Yeah, I mean, we start with certain key supply chain partners. Of course, OFI, just to call out Chris from before. We talk to our key supply chain partners. We're talking to key implementation partners on the ground. One thing we don't want to do is try to reinvent the wheel with our own resources, our own knowledge. A lot of that expertise is already there. So where we can find those key partners, like an IDH, for example, helping us to figure out, okay, where can we look to put our investment, again, tied to our overall strategy of what is our strategic focus? An example would be cocoa and coffee supply chains, beef and dairy supply chains, fruit and vegetable supply chains. These are such critical value chains for us in the long run. This is then kind of what guides our starting point. So it is a little bit of that risk-based starting point. And looking at how we want to manage those risks, but then ultimately go beyond that from a compliance perspective to really hit broader and more ambitious strategic objectives, whether that's in landscape restoration, decarbonization, livelihood co-benefits, et cetera.
Thanks. Akiva, let me come to you on your program is focused on nature-based solutions. Maybe we can talk about the distinction, nature-based solutions, landscape approaches. It would be good to ensure that everybody has at least a good understanding of when we talk about a landscape initiative, what do we actually mean? What are the characteristics that make something a landscape initiative rather than just a nice project that a company chooses to invest in the landscape?
Sure, thank you. Well, first of all, on what nature-based solutions are and how they differ from landscape initiative. A nature-based solution is just a repackaging of a conservation project that we would have been doing decades ago, but it's repackaged in a way that speaks more to business interests. So nature is used as a solution for what? For addressing climate impacts, for addressing social impacts, but in particular, in a way that companies are able to interact with that benefit value chains. A landscape initiative is the broader framing, the umbrella in which nature-based solutions and other types of interventions slot. So a landscape initiative is really just a way to try to engage all the relevant stakeholders across a vast area that can be defined by ecological boundaries, by jurisdictional boundaries, by supply shed, to engage all the relevant stakeholders so that they can together address the multiple drivers of nature loss and social challenges across that place. No single actor, company or otherwise, is able to address all of these things on their own. They have to be working together to align with government policy, to align with community interests and needs. Otherwise, any individual intervention, NBS or otherwise, will not be able to achieve its objectives or be durable for the long term. So that's what a landscape initiative is. It's just the umbrella in which all of this sits.
And do you find that, similar to what Rachel was saying, that companies are starting to look at that broader, both looking beyond their supply chains, but also the idea of collective investment or collective engagement?
Yeah, I think a lot of companies are internalizing the dependencies on nature. And as part of that, understanding that they have limited ability to affect change on their own. Companies can certainly make requests of their suppliers, incorporate no deforestation into their supply contracts, for example. But they don't have the same ability to extend beyond their direct corporate partnerships and relationships. So more and more companies are starting to think about landscape initiatives as a way to extend their influence beyond their direct contracting relationships. And they're, I think the most progressive companies are noticing that in so doing, they're able to mitigate some of the risks that they face as a company. A couple of the risks were already mentioned. You already mentioned, Rachel, the supply risk. This was mentioned by Chris on the previous panel as well. So securing supply is a critical need for companies. Another one that hasn't come up yet is that many companies have operations that exist in place, right? A mill exists in a place, and many of these operations are subject to physical risks. So I partner with a company that has a very large paper mill in the Atlantic forest in Brazil. They suffered a drought. The river that the mill is located on suffered a major drought about 7-8 years ago, and the mill couldn't operate for a time. And that is a significant cost, obviously. And so this company decided that in order to mitigate the risk of future drought, they needed to be working with partners upriver to do forest restoration to make sure that wouldn't happen. Now, they previously wouldn't have considered kind of funding forest restoration, kilometers and kilometers away from their mill, but they noticed that this was an impact that they needed to address going forward. They haven't been able to quantify what the future risk might be, but they've noticed that this is sufficiently risky that they needed to take action anyway. So most companies now who are acting are not acting because they can quantify the exact risk of inaction, but they know that it is a problem, and that's why they're starting to engage. I think the next, maybe you want to go here later in the panel, but the next sort of phase of this process is to be able to quantify some of those risks, because that's going to be a key part of the business case for more companies to make these investments.
Yeah, and that is exactly where we'll take the conversation. But before we do that, Anna, I want to come to you and just to another of Christopher's points, companies in general, and this is why I asked Akiva to talk through what a landscape approach is, don't have a good understanding of, maybe they understand what a landscape approach or initiative is intuitively, but it's the how to engage, what are the practical steps? And maybe you can talk to the need for that and how we might respond.
Thank you, Patrick, and thank you very much for the invite. The Accountability Framework Initiative is a coalition of 23 environmental and social NGOs. And what we want is to mainstream responsible supply chains with focus on deforestation and human rights. We've been doing this since 2019 when, the challenges were very different. And we started by basically helping companies to understand what was responsible production and sourcing required, like how you set goals, how you assess risks, how you engage suppliers, and so on, all the way to CDP's work, and how do you report transparently. And we understand that, and I think Audi would be a great example of a company aligned with the framework. We understand that companies that source commodities, they need to do that in 3 different levels. I think first and foremost, as you said, managing the attributes of the product volumes by. So where does this product come from? Does it attend market requirements, its own policies, or, is it associated with any deforestation risk? But on a second level, you need to engage with your suppliers and intermediaries, and because that's where the risks and opportunities really lie. I mean, you need to understand where those lays and how to address them. But then to the focus of our conversation, where it really matters, is that companies need to engage with their sourcing areas. And that, I think, is the crux of the matter, because long-term supply chain resilience depends on how and if the place where you source from is moving towards, stronger governance, improved outcomes for the producers and communities, better systems. And when you look at those 3 levels, I think it's clear that there is a limitation to the pure compliance focus or compliance status, because the compliance status tells you that, okay, the product volume that you buy today is not associated with deforestation after a certain cutoff date. But it doesn't really tell you, and I think that's what the questions that companies are grasping with at the moment. If you are going to be able to continue source from that same area in the long run, if that product will continue to be compliant, resilient, inclusive. So, of course, we understand compliance as something that should continue to be essential, but we see as backward looking. And amongst our coalition, we see the opportunity to complement this backwards looking product volume lens with a forward looking sourcing area lens. And that means, I think, as beautifully explained by Akiva and Rachel, a shift for companies, I think, first in terms of scale. So moving from looking at individual plots and farms towards wider sourcing areas, a shift on how companies connect with the places they source from. So in not only full segregation and physical control, but also establishing credible connections with the places that they source today and are going to continue sourcing in the future. I think a third element is a shift in purpose. I think until today, until recently, companies would avoid non-compliance. And I think now companies want to help prevent and address the underlying risks in these regions. So I think that comes to what we're discussing today, which is a shift in the formal action. It's like the challenges we have today that Akiva mentioned. They are complex. So individual action is no longer possible to guarantee that. So we really need collective approaches to address the systemic risks we're seeing.
Thank you. And I want to stay with this theme of longer term resilience. And Tom, come to you. Maybe we can just start with why the TNFD integrated landscapes as a component of how companies can respond on their nature obligations.
Yeah, thanks so much to everyone for inviting me here. So last year we published guidance on transition planning for nature, or integrating nature into corporate and financial transition plans. And for us, a really important part of that was this piece about landscape initiatives and collaboration within particular places. So in the guidance, we really built on the models that we've seen for climate transition planning that are well established from GFANZ and the Transition Plan Task Force. But we added in this extra component about place-based collaboration, because throughout the TNFD's history, which is not that long, 5 years, but we've really put a lot of emphasis on location and how nature-related dependencies and impacts and the risks and opportunities take place in specific locations. And you need to understand what is the state of nature, what are the ecosystem services available in those locations, and who are the people and other actors in those locations in order to understand your own sort of vulnerabilities as a company. And therefore, it made complete sense that when you're looking to respond to those issues, you then need to also work with those other people in those locations to collectively better manage the environmental resources that are in those locations. That's going to be more cost effective. You're going to have, you're less likely to be doing things that are working against each other. And you're just much more likely to have better outcomes, right? Especially if you need to act across a much like we were hearing about this example of the paper mill. You have to act across very large geographies in order to really shift the resilience of the ecosystem services that you're depending on. And so it just made complete sense for us that this would be a key part of any company's transition plan. And so we're really grateful to the team for the support you provided us on making that work.
And we heard in the first panel that it was a lot about climate, really cracking the climate accounting nut for landscape approaches is going to be critical. But can you speak to the yeah, that's it, right? The end days. Can you speak to just to the number of companies that have engaged with TNFD and potentially why nature is also on the table?
Yeah, so we've now got over 800 companies that have published TNFD reports. So reports that set out how companies have assessed what their nature-related dependencies, impacts, risks, and opportunities, and what so what they mean for their business and what governance they have around those. And so, I mean, that's the take-up we've seen in the short amount of time that TNFD has been working on this has been really exciting. Not yet seeing so much take up on the transition planning. I think that's a much earlier stage piece, but we have published recently an updated set of case studies showing how companies are starting to incorporate some of these different approaches we came up with. What was the second part of the question? Sorry, that was it.
That's fine.
That was it.
That's
Sorry.
What I do want to, I want to make the shift to just digging in, not just to the reporting frameworks, but it's around how do we practically get landscapes to be recognized by companies, be enabling companies to report out on their investments, and ultimately, how does that help to scale that level of investment? And so, Tom, I'll start with you, but just in terms of the reporting frameworks, and we can talk TNFD, we can talk more broadly. It'll be good to understand what kinds of expectations that puts on companies, and whether you see that as being a driver of what they then expect from their investments and from landscapes.
I see. So I think, so for TNFD, we've got sort of three components, really. We've got this sort of assessment and the reporting and then the response. And I think we have landscapes and engagement with other people and actors in those landscapes at every stage across the whole piece. So in the assessment piece, really important, as I was just saying, to work with the other actors in the landscapes where you're operating or in your value chain to understand what are the risks to your business. So if you're having impacts on a location or nature and location, that's going to be affecting other people and other businesses, and that could in turn create risks for you, but you won't understand those unless you're talking to these other people. And obviously the same works in the other direction. Then in the disclosure, again, you need to be explaining, like, how have you identified your risks and opportunities, and including how have you worked with others to do that assessment, because otherwise you're going to probably have an incomplete assessment and you're not going to be identifying all the information you need to be identifying. And then in the management, again, as I was just saying, how are you then working to then manage those risks collectively within a location? And if you can show you're participating in like a really well-structured landscape initiative, that's obviously going to look much more credible to your investors and other stakeholders as a risk management process than if you're sort of trying to do these things independently, which inevitably is going to be less effective. Obviously, there are challenges with that. There are not landscape initiatives everywhere that you might want to be managing risks. You know, we put in the guidance on transition planning, some of the ways you might prioritize across your locations, including thinking about where are there already landscape initiatives where we can make a difference quickly, because we can just join in an initiative that already exists. But that's not always going to be the case. Sometimes you will have a location that you're going to need to start from scratch, or just start small, bring in a few partners and try and build something up. But I'm sure the others on the panel can talk a bit more about how that works.
And I want to step back and put a plug in. Karen in the previous panel mentioned the core maturity criteria that the Landscape Practitioner Network developed and is integrating into various frameworks. And that's just it's a very simple set of guidelines that essentially lay out these are the types of things within a landscape that are good indicators of the robustness of that landscape. One of the challenges we're working with in landscape approaches is that the practical impacts, the measurable impacts that companies want to report against may take 10, 15 years to be delivered. In the interim, what gives those companies enough confidence to invest in that transition? And having a good structure in place, whether that's the multi-stakeholder governance, the monitoring of performance over time, those are the types of things that are good proxies until we get the impact we need. And Rachel, maybe I can come to you on that, just in terms of the data that you're expecting as a company. Would Aldi Süd invest in a landscape based on those types of more governance or structural indicators, or what would it take to make that a good value proposition?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're kind of in this space where we recognize we want a lot of governance and structure. And I think the more convergence we can see around the core concepts of different frameworks and in order to validate a direction of travel, the better it is, because the more confidence we can distill from that. At the same time, we do need to be able to demonstrate progress, and we need to be able to capture that. We need to be able to claim it, report on it, even if it's internal, ideally externally as well. And so I feel like then we get to a little bit of a tension between strict, strong, well-validated governance and structure around how you set something up, how you undertake these activities, what measurement and validation and reporting, what that looks like, who can claim what, and that may be hindering more scaling and kind of a rapid acceleration in this investment, because it makes it a little bit tougher to unlock a lot of those funds, again, at scale. So I think to try and get back to the question though, Patrick, I mean, I think we need to be able to understand and set a baseline. We need to be able to have practical measurements. We have an assumption that any activities that we set up will be specific to that landscape and to the needs that are there. Hopefully it's as holistic as possible, considering the livelihoods piece as well as the environmental piece. And then some type of KPI, put into place where, again, practically we can demonstrate some kind of progress. But we do really rely on kind of those key frameworks relevant for that commodity, as well as implementation partners to help us set that direction of travel and really build that confidence internally.
Thanks. Just to build right off that last point to Akiva now, just recognizing those frameworks do kind of set the guide rails. You've done some work, I believe, in mapping exactly what is being asked from the various frameworks. Can you speak a little bit to that work?
Sure. Yeah, we recently did a big analysis of 15 of what we think are the leading corporate reporting frameworks that companies are engaging in. So your SBTI and the multiple different guidances under that, CDP, TNFD, and also some of the regulatory ones, CSRD and so forth. We unpacked the specific requirements in each of the frameworks that NBS investments, place-based investments, can deliver for companies reporting. And we crosswalked those requirements against a set of metrics that we, WWF, are tracking across our portfolio of landscape initiatives that we engage in. These are not just WWF metrics. Many of these metrics are used by many others. They're things like hectares restored and volume of water replenished and things like that. And through that crosswalk, we identified that basically all of these frameworks offer significant opportunity for companies to increase their ability to report using place-based and NBS investments. We also saw from an analysis of current company disclosures about their NBS investments that they are currently not maximizing their ability to translate impacts from their investments into these corporate reporting frameworks. So there's lots of opportunity for companies to extract additional value from their investments by understanding how the impacts that they're driving map onto the different reporting frameworks that they're engaging in. Now, I don't think that any company is likely to be making investments because they're trying to boost their score on whatever disclosure framework they're using. They're making investments, like we talked about before, because they want to mitigate risk or secure supply chains. But there's additional value they can realize by understanding how the impacts that they're driving map onto these reporting frameworks that they're already engaging in.
Yeah, I like that. Let's stay on this theme of realizing value, because I think we need to recognize that first and foremost, as you just said, this is a risk and resilience proposition. But if we can make landscape initiatives also attractive in other ways or of other benefit to companies, then that helps to shift the balance. Anna, maybe I can get your thoughts on that. And just again, in the AFI context and the guidance that you have for companies, to what extent is that helping to both set expectations but create a value proposition? Like, do the companies, do they see meeting the guidance as an obligation, or where are they deriving the benefits there?
No, I don't think they see the guidance as an obligation. I think they see it as a source of inspiration, but also a very useful tool to help them align and deliver on complex goals across, different geographies and especially very complex value chains. So as I said, our guidance already covers what collaboration means on the ground, and we started this work in terms of what engaging with sourcing area could look like. But as you know, we are now expanding that guidance to really be able to respond to companies' need on how they can engage with area level mechanisms that are locally owned in terms, not only in terms of governance, but also in terms of what they expect for that engagement to produce in terms of outcome. And I think we want to answer a few questions. I think first, to understand what this area action means and how can it be integrated within the responsible sourcing strategy that companies have, how this area level action and how this investment can be integrated. We have frameworks like CDP that already asked companies to report that, but that's not yet connected within the company's strategy. I think there is another question that we want to respond as well, is what makes this area level mechanisms credible and effective for responsible sourcing strategies, and then on a next level, how can we ensure that this area level mechanisms are achieving the necessary level of interoperability and alignment. So I think there's a lot of questions we want to respond, to be able to offer Audi and the universe of companies this guidance, and as it is not ever an individual effort, we're doing that with our coalition, with partners at the Landscape Practitioners Network. But we also doing that based on, what we see on the ground on key sourcing regions. So what's already working, what's already happening that is working on the ground, and what the evidence can teach us, as well as with companies through partnerships with, for example, WBCSD. So what companies understand is a useful guidance for them to move forward as quickly as possible. And we hope to have that by 2027.
By when?
2027.
2027, there we go. I've been a little remiss in my moderator duties. I'm supposed to mention, because of the heat, we do have extra water in the back if anybody needs to grab a drink. And also, we do want to have some of your questions to inform the discussion today. And I don't know if you've been putting them in. If you were here for the first panel, there was a Slido with a QR code. I'm not sure if, is that the QR code? There we go. No? That's the QR code. If anyone has any questions, Billy, have any questions come in so far? It's okay. I'm not going to come to you yet. So please do put in a couple questions. We do want to get your input and make this more of a discussion. I want to come to something Rachel said about just some of the complexities that need to be worked out. You know, particularly to make the value proposition as clear and accessible and of value, we do need to figure out challenges like, what do people get to say, on what basis, who gets to say what? Rachel, can you speak a little to what kinds of claims Aldi Sud might want to make, if any, about your engagements? Or a microphone.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's anything too groundbreaking. I think we want to be able to make credible claims on where we can tackle our flag emissions in particular, where we can talk about hectares of land restored, where we can talk about water replenished, and maybe what might be a little bit trickier in terms of to keep the phrase from earlier, cracking the nut, is sort of how we've impacted livelihoods in a positive way. So maybe just starting there. I mean, I think that's really what it comes down to. And then I think there are different sub KPIs more broadly that we want to be able to track, and that can relate to, again, deforestation. What do we have in transition? What can we credibly claim as deforestation or conversion free? That can get into the work of our suppliers and their efforts towards setting validated targets for climate. Yeah, and then where we might be able to, when it comes to a longer term roadmap, you know, where we rely on frameworks like AFI to guide us on, okay, what investments or what next steps should we make in the event that we want to progress, but we are maybe missing key points of leverage or control over our supply chain, being able to, again, to credibly talk about landscape investments, right? Whether that's in palm or soy, which are going to be incredibly tricky commodities for us, but are still very, very relevant when you consider the whole range of the products that we would have as a retailer.
Yeah, absolutely. And Tom, maybe I'll broaden it out a little for you. Just can you speak at all to challenges that you've seen companies facing when they start to engage on nature-related activities?
More specifically about reporting and claims, or
yeah, I mean, if you can speak to claims, great. If it needs to be broader, then I don't want to put you on the spot.
No, that's fine. The TNFD recommends a certain number of core metrics for reporting on all dependencies and impacts that that companies have. There is obviously a challenge where if you're contributing positively to some shift, you know, you can report the total change that you've seen in the landscape. So improvement in the condition of the ecosystem or whatever it happens to be, but you can't attribute that all to yourself. So there is a tricky balance to be struck there. And I think what we generally say is report both your contribution and then the outcome you've seen. And if you're just thinking about trying to explain the resilience of your dependencies, then ultimately the landscape level outcome is what you want to report. That is the information that's useful to the investors and other users of the reports, because that's telling them about the resilience of the business. But if you want to be telling a positive impact story, which is a slightly different kind of story to tell, then it becomes a bit trickier, as we were just hearing. I mean, other challenges is inevitably, I mean, it's all the classic things. It's challenges to see what's going on in the value chain, where exactly you're sourcing things from, and the challenges of using proxy data and whether that's really telling you what's going on in your particular case, or it's just sort of more standard, typical averages for whatever region you might be sourcing from, if you can get that even that close. And there's also just a lot of uncertainty, I think, in the data. We've currently got a consultation out about environmental crime, which Paulina on the previous panel was also involved with. And what really came through there for me was you might think you've got really good traceability, but actually environmental crime could mean that the product you're buying is actually being blended with something that's illegally produced, and there may be all sorts of hidden dependencies and impacts in your value chain that you don't know about. So it's even more complicated and scary. But it was really quite, I think that was a particular challenge that I think came through quite interestingly.
And I think the middle part there where you alluded to the contribution claims that companies want to make. I mean, I think this is really one of the crux issues, is the ability to on the one hand, be able to claim this is the work that we have contributed to, different from this is the work that we were responsible for, or the outcomes that we were responsible for. And that distinction really makes a difference when companies want to be reporting against a target or have some external obligations they need to meet. So I think it is one of those crux issues that we need further work on, and we don't want to just gloss over the fact. But it does make sense that for now, being able to talk about the collective contribution and the role that you played in delivering on collective outcomes, I think is a good interim step. Akiva, just same sort of question to you, and then I want to come to audience questions. If we think about practically what is needed to overcome some of these challenges, you know, if you're talking with companies, how are you convincing them that landscape approaches are worth investing in?
Well, some of what I was talking about before, but I want to build from there. You know, companies, like I said, have only so much ability to affect change by focusing on their own supply chains, and so that's a reason to be thinking broader in the wider landscape. But I think a big problem is that we tend, as a community, to be overemphasizing the role that companies can or should be playing in landscape initiatives. Companies have a critical role to play, but there are lots of parts of landscape initiatives that just won't be funded by companies, right? Straight up forest conservation tends not to be the kind of thing that companies are going to fund because it doesn't have a return usually. Lots of things don't have returns. And so there's a critical role for other sources of funding, from foundations, from public sources, to fund these parts of an initiative. Now, that's a challenge because of the current funding environment, obviously. But we can't lose sight of that and expect companies to fully step in and fund all this work that previously governments were funding more. On the other hand, there's a role for companies to step up even further than they have been already. Unfortunately, much of the corporate funding for this type of work so far has been coming from sustainability budgets. Not to minimize the importance of that. Sustainability budgets are critical because they have much more flexibility to fund things than other cost centers in a company. But companies have a lot of value that they realize from these investments in landscape initiatives that should be able to unlock other cost centers that could support this work. And I'm thinking procurement, I'm thinking marketing. There are other cost centers as well. And we tend in the conservation community to be talking mostly with the sustainability folks and companies and not as much with the rest of the company. I think we need to be empowering our counterparts on the sustainability teams to have these conversations with other colleagues in their organizations to make the case that these investments matter to the business beyond what the sustainability team wants to fund.
Which kind of brings us full circle, recognizing the role of this session and the morning workshop in total has been about resilience and really understanding how important that is as a core message and basis for company decision making, and the extent to which we can show that investing in landscapes does make your long-term security of supply more resilient. It really does create the business case for those other cost centers. Billy, let's hear from the floor. What kind of questions have we had coming in?
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for everyone for logging on to Slido, because we've got quite a few coming in now. And so actually to start picking up on the theme of the kind of the data and the metrics that you're looking to kind of report on. And maybe for Rachel to start with, what's the kind of constraint you're seeing for companies to be able to act on landscape and nature data? Like what's the quality and availability of the data you're able to get? How is there a gap between the reportable data and the decision making that needs to come into where to invest kind of company finances towards sustainability initiatives? And yeah, what's the link, I guess, with the claims that you'd be looking to make?
I mean, it's we're a little bit earlier kind of in the journey of actually bringing in these landscape investments into a portfolio to level up towards ultimately our strategic objectives. So I think some of the main challenges we're seeing right now is again, we're looking at very different landscapes across very different commodities across the globe. So we want to make sure that we have a set of measures and as well as indicators that are fit for purpose in that area. And there isn't just one kind of MRV approach or framework that we're following. We're looking at a lot of different frameworks that are available, and again, really trying to look at where those overlaps in the core concepts that we then feel can really steer our decisions. Challenges within our own data, and maybe I can try to put this out here. I don't know if this is really answering the question, but I think it goes into two steps, just because Akiva, you had mentioned kind of bringing in some of these other functions within the business. If we think about requirements we set on the final products that we sell, that can be easy for our buyers to understand, easy for procurement departments to integrate into their work, and then also that can be passed down to suppliers. I think where we can find as retailers, I think where we've had success in the past is where you have product level requirements that everyone can kind of get behind and align on. And you create more of that, again, convergence and similarity then, and you can leverage then that where we've, again, had success in certain commodities going back years and years with Rainforest Alliance certification, fair trade, et cetera. So I think for us right now, trying to bridge work within programs and projects on the ground, and all the technical rigor that we need there in order to justify our investments and continue with our program, and ultimately hopefully get impact that we can talk about and claim, and bridging that to all the way back up to the final products that these commodities come into, the commodities that depend on these landscapes. And again, figuring out, well, what are we doing at that product level that complements the work that we would do all the way back towards the landscape or on farm?
Can I build on that, Billy, a little bit? On sort of data requirements, hearkening back to the analysis I mentioned where we looked at these 15 corporate reporting frameworks, there's a big difference between what's required on climate metrics and what's required on nature and social metrics. So typically, these frameworks require very specific methods to be used when reporting on climate impacts. The same is not true for nature and social at the moment, at least. Right now, across the board, the frameworks typically request, report on, restoration, report on conservation, but they don't request specific methods to be used, which is both a good thing and a bad thing. In the short term, it's a good thing because companies have the opportunity very flexibly to use whatever metrics, whatever methods they like to be reporting the impacts in these categories. So there's a lot of opportunity to be, increasing your ability to disclose and report using these frameworks. In the long run, we know that companies thrive on certainty and clear guidance. And so it may not be a good thing in the long run to have this wide open flexibility. I expect there'll be some consolidation in the field over time as the nature and social metrics sort of move more towards the climate space and consolidate around specific methods to be used, at which point companies will benefit from knowing exactly how to report on this stuff. But in the meantime, there's lots of opportunities to be reporting regardless of the methods that you're using.
Thank you. And actually, while we're on that topic, straight back to you, Akiva, because one of the other questions is around what the metrics are for resilience. So how are we actually able to measure resilience, and how close are we to having one kind of KPI, one measure for resilience for companies and investors?
Yeah, I don't think we're close. I mean, there are multiple definitions of resilience. I mean, we could have had a whole panel on that. Even within WWF, which is obviously a large, complex organization, there's not necessarily a single definition of resilience. It depends on the partner that we're talking to. I mean, we lean into their definitions often and enable them to deliver the impact that they're looking to deliver for their definition of resilience. We have a particular framework that we use in assessing the resilience of a place, and we go through that. But companies don't always have the same way of looking at resilience, and so it's not necessarily the case that we are able to sort of put forth, here are the indicators of resilience. It's very context dependent. And I think that, like, similar to what I was saying just now, it's a good thing and a bad thing, right? For now, companies are able to deliver on their versions of resilience by finding partners in the places that they want to focus and delivering those impacts. But as the world potentially moves to wanting to show, here's how we are resilient globally or across the board using the same terms, that's going to sort of cut into the ability to be this flexible. So the short answer is we don't have a clear set of indicators at the moment because there's no one definition of resilience.
Can I add to that one? So I think it's important to recognize when we talk about resilience that, there are as Akiva says, multiple definitions, but we're talking about two different things. One is resilience of the business, and that is, the long-term ability to continue to source your products, for example. And that's different but related to ecological resilience as, the health of the ecosystem. And I think in talking with companies, you can boil it down to an indicator, the basic concept of understanding where are the primary or most significant risks to the future integrity or availability of inputs to your business is an exercise that all companies should be going through. And in coming to the results of those exercises, you get a picture of what are the issues that are most important to address in my supply chain. And that's really the point of resilience, is to understand what are the things that we need to address, and through a landscape approach, recognize that many of those issues are best addressed collectively and at scale. I think we have time for one more question.
Oh, the choices. So let me go to Tom, and we've got a question about how many companies are actually willing to disclose sensitive information about their business activities in nature-related disclosures. And I'm wondering what you're seeing in terms of, what's coming through from TNFD. And then I might expand the scope of that to go to Anna to say about what are we seeing with kind of that collective monitoring and the engagement with companies to be able to do that on a broader level.
And I will say, I just got the evil eye, so if we can keep the answer short, that would be great.
So, as I mentioned, we have now over 800 TNFD reports out there in the world for everyone to scrutinize. But nevertheless, it is still early days, and people are tending to still report very initial analysis, or maybe just a subset of their business. So, have there been any great revelations yet? I don't know. I do read the reports, but I can't claim to have read every single one. And I think we're still a process in the market of learning how to do this well. And investors and other stakeholders are in a process of learning how to interpret these reports and to then use them to ask the right questions of the companies. Like, oh, you didn't talk about this thing. There's this gap here. What's going on there? These are the kind of questions that these kind of reports can then start to provoke. So I'm sure there have been some interesting revelations in these reports, but I don't have any specific examples, but hopefully they will get there soon.
Sorry, I didn't understand the question.
I think, okay, sorry. So just in terms of the willingness of companies to collaborate and share data that's supportive of the overall landscape initiative. What are you seeing in terms of how that we can bring that together, and what else is needed to help engage that collaboration? And Rachel's also nodding, so feel free to jump in.
Well, I think that varies from sector to sector. I think traditionally we have the defense sector, for example, that's been collaborating for decades and sharing strategic data to advance technology and to be able to be more effective. I think that trickles down to the extractive sector. They also collaborates and share data to address, the ability to obtain license to operate. And we also see a lot of forums within the food and ag sector, retailers especially, where companies get together and understand that the challenge of resilience is shared. There is not one single answer, and as Rachel said, what we need now is alignment on guidance, because we have a fragmentation of data and initiatives and possibilities. And I think, if the civil society can align on what's needed, what's expected, and how landscapes can respond to these needs in a way that will produce the outcome for both sides necessary, I think we are on a good go.
Well, then let's end with that. The only thing that remains for me is to give a big thanks to the panelists. I really appreciate the helpful discussion today. So thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. So this concludes our session. I want to give a big thanks to our speaker, our moderators, and all our panelists today. I felt inspired. I hope the audience did as well. I want to thank Good Enough College for hosting this wonderful event, as well as the technical team making everything work both here and online. A particular thanks to the organizing team, Billy, Mariana, not here in the room, but also very important, Daniel, Margot, Nezrin, for pulling this off and for having a very fluent, hot topic event. I want to obviously suggest, if you heard a lot of interesting stuff, please also visit the websites of ISEAL, Jurisdictional Action Network, J Resource Hub, as well as SourceUp to find the initiatives to actually engage in. And then I want to conclude with a big thanks to the audience for braving the weather here, coming here. Also for the people staying online for quite a long time. That is highly appreciated. But in return, we would also love your feedback. So as part of Slido, which you have probably already answered, there will be questions. It would be highly appreciated if you would answer them to help us create better and more useful content and events. A very important one, please leave your lanyards when you use outside so we can reuse them. And lastly, a wish. I hope you found some new approaches, resources, information that is helpful for your work. And I wish that anywhere today or in the coming days, you reflect on what that means for how you work and how you can impact resilient landscapes. So thank you so much for being here. I wish you a good rest of your day and a successful London Climate Action Week.